Well, good morning. Good morning, good morning. This morning, we're going to look at Galatians chapter 5 again. We're going to be looking at the 8 or 9, depends on what Bible you have, different terms that Paul uses to talk about what we called this morning in Bible class a spectrum of antisocial behavior. And I took that from a commentary written by N.T. Wright. These are 8 terms that are a powerful rebuke against the Galatians. And a few weeks ago, we warned that, or Paul warned Galatians that if they continued biting and devouring one another, that's Galatians chapter 5 and verse 15, if you're following along with us. But if you bite and devour one another, take care lest you be consumed by one another. So Paul's warning them, if they bite and devour one another, they will be consumed. They will be destroying one another. And so if they continue to behave that way, they were going to undermine any sort of sustained Jesus-shaped picture that they were going to portray to the world. That Jesus-shaped witness, their testimony of what Jesus had done in their life, the changes that they have seen in their life, that they were going to undermine that witness to the world around them. And so I don't think that we should speculate necessarily that Paul thought that works were only these surface things and that the fruit came from somewhere deeper. I think it is kind of the opposite. The works proceed, they come out of somewhere deeper within us. They come out of the deep recesses of our fallen human personality that Paul calls the flesh. He doesn't mean our physical flesh is evil like the Gnostics believed. So flesh doesn't mean the physical side of human nature. Physical actions are not necessarily evil. Sex is one example that we've already given. But Paul is now going to move into 8 or 9 characteristics of a group of people that have factions among them, that are driven apart by strife. And he's going to use a lot of different words here. But a church that is disunified. And these 8 words are so close in meaning that translating them often becomes a problem because there's so much overlap in the words. And so Paul seems to be, it's like he's determined to lay as much stress as possible on these words: hostilities, strife, jealousy, bursts of anger, selfish ambition, factiousness, divisions, and one person defines this as moods of envy. So it's not just envy or envying, it's the disposition of having envy. And he rounds off that list with what we're going to look at next week with drunkenness and wild partying. Just to make clear what company that you might be keeping if you were living in that fleshly way. So we're back to our Venn diagram that we had a few weeks ago. I have it here written on the board beside me, or I have it on the slide behind me also. Even if we just take a cursory view, just an initial look behind the curtain of our society, you will see indications that the people of our society today live in the way that are described here in verse 20 and 21. And it's an unhappy and it's a dangerous place. It's also deeply disunited, our society, especially Western society. And Paul's point throughout the letter has been the unity of the Messiah's people. He wants Peter and the other people, the Judaizers from Jerusalem, to live as a unity in a community. And so Paul's point has been that unity of the people of the Messiah throughout this letter, and even if all around them are factions and divisions and social competitions, especially in their day for honor and worth, right? It maybe even in fact exactly because there will be such things of people going after honor and worth, there will be strife. And so I think it's vital that we as Christ followers, as Messiah followers, as Messiah's people, that we should live in a radically different way because of the radical thing that Jesus did for us. And this is what he's going to sketch out here. Paul's going to sketch out here in verses 22 through 23 when we talk about the fruits of the Spirit. We'll talk about that in a few weeks. But now let's get back to our Venn diagram of the flesh and the Spirit. And so Paul depicts the earth as made up of two different realms. And these two realms are in conflict with one another, but they are also overlapping. One realm is a realm that flesh is ruling in, and one realm is a realm in which the Spirit is ruling in. And these realms are not just static locations. This is not heaven, and this is not earth, and then suddenly we go to heaven and then everything's all good. That's not what's going on here. Each realm here is dynamic. There's stuff happening in each one. You don't just leave the earth and go to heaven and suddenly you're in the spiritual realm. Because there's an overlap here and things are happening in each realm. And so each realm generates a certain type of individual. And what Paul is going to say here is that the type of actions generated in the fleshly realm, the one on the left here, are destructive. And the type of actions, the dynamics of the spirit realm is life-giving and fruitful. They are generative. They generate things. They don't destroy things. They generate good. And so I think the idea here is obvious, for me at least, is that Paul is giving the Galatians and us a measuring stick for our own community. Is our community a spirit-building community? Or are we a community of enmity or hatred or feuding or strife? Are we a community of life or are we a community of destruction? And so the community aspect here of Paul's letter, we can't overlook it. We can't ignore it. Oftentimes, we try and make Galatians out to be this individual salvation thing. Like, oh, you just need to have faith because Paul says here it's faith over law. And so that means if you just believe, you'll be saved. Well, somewhat. But what he's actually saying here is that this is a community dynamic. This is not just an individual dynamic. So the works of the flesh and the fruits of the Spirit are not a checklist to make an individual more spiritual or spirit-filled. That's a common term nowadays. Paul is talking about the type of cosmic realities that animate us, that give us life. Are we given life through the flesh and the destructiveness of the flesh? And do we live our life that way, or do we live our life according to the Spirit that gives life to communities and unifies them? Paul wants to give his friends, his community, his people in Galatia there, he wants to give them glasses so they can discern what the negative fleshly dynamics are that are trying to overtake their community, so that you can see the results. On the one hand, you can see the work of the Spirit of life and the life-giving fruits that come out of that. And on the other hand, you have idolatry at work. And it will only lead to destruction. And so that's the first half of that chapter so far. And that's the foundation for what we have this morning. In a nutshell, Paul says, don't turn back to the law. It's death. Turn to being led by the Spirit, and you'll have life. So in that fleshly realm, there's certain things that animate people of the flesh. People of the flesh will be like these things that we have already listed, whether it's immorality, sexual immorality, having sexual partners outside of marriage, or whether we're talking about idolatry, whether that's literally bowing down to a statue or believing in a different God, or whether that is putting something in that same God-shaped hole in our heart that shouldn't be there, something like politics or political beliefs, right? This morning, though, we're going to talk about these 8 or 9 things that are all, it's like they're in orbit around a central point. And we're going to get there at the end. We'll sort of tie it all together. But I'm going to run through these things real quick this morning so we can see them. And the first one here is enmity. I don't know how you get away with writing a definition with word in it. If you're trying to define the word, you don't just use the word for the definition. But that's what this person did. Discord or feuding. Feuding and discord breaks social relationships such that the community then begins to break down. This is antisocial behavior. Not in a sense of you're not a cool person because you're wearing the wrong color jacket, antisocial, but this is breaking society, these types of behavior. Hatred and enmity lead to broken societies. The second word, take care lest you be consumed by one another. So it reminds us that this might be like an altercation, a physical struggle against one another, a rivalry, right? Often a heated argument or a dispute, or what we would call a clash. This happened in 1 Corinthians when Paul is writing to the church there in Corinth, that they had disputes about who was the greatest teacher and who they followed. Some said they were of Apollos, some said they were of Paul, some said they were of Jesus. And this was disunifying the church there. And Paul commands them to take out their faulty reasoning and arguing over opinion, and they need to settle on carrying out God's will. So that's strife. Now we get to jealousy, and we see that word zealous. That is the root where our English word zealousness or zealous comes from. It can be used in a positive sense or a negative sense. And it's a disposition also, because it gives you the inclination to suspect that there's rivalry going on. And so you should want whatever they want because this is a rivalry and he's trying to get ahead of me and therefore I should want it. It necessarily includes malice in your heart because you want something that somebody else has so that you can be better than they are or have more power or whatever it happens to be. It's not wrong to be jealous over something that belongs to you already, right? God's jealous of our devotion and our worship, right? Because there's not any other true gods that could share those things. We're going to get to envy here in a few seconds, so I don't want to step on it. But jealousy in a bad sense is hating the other person because they have something that you want. Let's keep going. Thumos, that is translated as fits or outbursts of anger. The King James is translated as wrath. This is an anger that boils up. Here on the slide it says swellings of anger. It's boiling, bubbling up. And it comes out like a bubble and it just pops and it comes out, and it might include violence. It might include profanity or angry words. And all of these things lead to the sinful expression of that anger. We might see this in spousal abuse, where in fact, here in Alaska, domestic violence is the highest rate of anywhere in the country because of the anger that bubbles up, the thumos, the wrath that bursts out. There's other factors in that Paul will get to, such as drunkennesses. But right now we're just talking about that anger. So let's keep on. The next word, King James translates as strife. Many other translations have it as rivalries or selfish rivalries, something that is a dispute between two parties, but you're only concerned about, of course, your own self. It's a contentious disposition. And I think God warns us against having and maintaining rivalries, that they aren't healthy for us. If you're constantly trying to set yourself apart, constantly trying to set yourself apart for the sake of being apart, that is rivalry. That's selfish ambition. We think of the sons of Zebedee, James and John, right? Grant us that we may sit, this is Mark 10, verse 37. Grant us that we may sit, one on your right hand and the other on the left in your glory. They want that selfish ambition so that then they can be ahead of everyone. So we're getting back to that jealousy idea. The next word, King James Version, has seditions. We don't use seditions in the same way that we do nowadays in English. We generally have relegated this word to a political meaning, whereas it could have been anything back in the day. But now we use the word dissensions. That is standing apart from. Remember, this is really what the whole lesson this morning is about. These eight or nine terms that are orbiting around the central idea of behavior that separates us from our brother. That is disunifying behavior. And this dissensions is sort of that central term. That is a literal standing apart. I am going to move apart from somebody because I have made them angry. Making people angry with each other would be the verbal form of this. To cut into two parts. I'm reading a part of the definition from Thayer here. To cut into two parts, or in King James English, to cleave asunder, right? To dissever, to cut off, like a limb. Right? What is Proverbs 6? A brother or dissension is one who sows discord among the brethren, right? And he lists that among the 7 abominable things that the Lord hates. heresies. That's how the King James translates it, because the word, if you look at the translation here that I have, heresies is how you pronounce it. So, strictly speaking, if we're talking about translating the Greek meaning of the word, not what we in English think of the word heresies as meaning, it means a choice or an option. And of course, if you have a choice or an option that is in relation to religion, then we've made sects of religion. S-E-C-T-S. Sects of religion. We've made factions. We've made contentious divisions. Again, we're looking at how the self-willed choice or an opinion then leads us away from the truth, to divide over, to bring us away from the truth. This is a dissension that arises over an opinion varying from the true Christian faith. It's something that's going to divide us. Next come the last two words here, and they are very similar. And let me go ahead and speak to the reason. I didn't say this during the Bible class, but let me speak to the reason as to why there are 9 words in some Bibles and 8 in some other Bibles. It's because probably some of the very oldest manuscripts don't have this last word that's going to come up next after this one. But many, many very reliable manuscripts do have the next word, and that is murders, after envying here. And so these 2 words, if you look at the Greek, focus on the Greek, I'm going to change the slide. It says PH, so kind of like an F, FTH, phonos. If we look at the next one, it's phonos. So you can see they're very, very similar in spelling. There's only 1 letter difference. And so there's some question as to whether somebody accidentally copied it twice, or a question as to somebody thought it was copied twice and so they left it off. And so that's what's going on with the reason there's 8 words in some Bibles and 9 in others. King James has here envyings, and this is pretty uniformly translated across the board as envy. Excuse me. Envy is that desire, right? Is the desire to deprive others of what they have, right? This is a little bit different than jealousy. I remember I said there's a little bit different. So jealousy is wanting what they have. Envying wants what they have, but wants to take it from them. Jealousy desires to have the same sort of thing for yourself, but not necessarily to take it from them. Envying wants to take it from them. This word, at least, phonos. So it's even so important as to be in the 10 Commandments. If we look at the 10 Commandments, commandment number 10, God cautions his people, right, about envying their neighbor's possessions. Because there's nothing good that can come from envying your neighbor's possessions and desiring to have his belongings. Not just something like his, but his belongings. Right? What about Cain and Abel? Was it envy that moved Cain when he saw that God preferred Abel's sacrifice? He wanted that blessing for himself. What about Joseph's brothers, right? They were resentful, and they saw the blessing that their father was giving to him. So they sold him to steal that blessing for themselves, right? Envy is like a plague for the church. And the last one here is hatred. Phonos, hatred. It's closely related to the word for murder. Well, it is translated as murder. So this word here, and this word group, what does division lead to? Division, whether it is over opinion or whether it's over envy and jealousy, those things lead to necessarily killing, whether we're talking about physical killing, whether we're talking about spiritual, or whether we're talking about social. If I'm going to kill somebody's persona, or if I'm going to kill somebody's, what's the word I'm looking for? Their reputation, in that day and time would have been the same as killing them, because they would no longer be able to support themselves. Nobody would do business with them. And so this murder, whether it is physical or spiritual, is important because it was going to consume them. It was going to divide them. But if you bite and devour one another, take care lest you be consumed by one another. The ultimate outcome of these things, if we let them bubble up and build and build and build, is that we will consume one another and there will be death and destruction instead of life in the Spirit. And that's the main idea for this morning, right? And what does Paul say is the ultimate outcome of these things besides murder? In verse 21, and things like these of which I forewarn you, just as I have forewarned you, that the practice of such things shall not inherit the kingdom of God. I warn you, as I warned you before, that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. That's the ESV. This is a factual statement. Paul isn't passing judgment here on individuals necessarily, but this is the nature of God's will for us here in Sitka and his ultimate purpose. This is not a God who's filled with hate towards individuals like these, and he has to take it out, that hate, on his son on the cross. That's what some people believe. That's not how this works. God doesn't hate these people. He loves them. He wants them to be a part of him so much that he gave his son. This is about God's wonderful purpose to restore the world and get it back on track at long last. Right? Because Jesus is coming again. Right? This is the Sunday that much of the Christian world celebrates as the Resurrection Sunday, Easter, Passover, Holy Week. There's a lot of different names for it, whether you're Jewish or Christian. The fact that Jesus is coming again means that by definition, there will be no room in the kingdom for this type of behavior. If he's coming to restore the world back to its unity with God, these types of behaviors of the flesh, the fleshly nature of things, cannot be included in his kingdom. Because these types of behaviors are destructive. And God is about life. A scholar named William Barclay, he was writing about Galatians here, and he observed that each of these sins is a perversion of something that is good. Right? Fornication is a perversion of sex, which is good when done in the covenant of marriage. Uncleanness, sensuality, these are perversions of the sexual instinct that itself can be a very beautiful thing. when it's a part of that covenant between man and a woman. But when it's perverted, separates us from each other as individuals, as members of a community of Christ, when there's divorce, and ultimately from God. My point here is that Christian virtue is a team sport. And I said this last time. Christian virtue is a team sport. We have to act as a society that is unified together in Christ. You can't do love. You can't do peace. You can't do patience and gentleness, as we get to in the next few weeks. You can't do those things by yourself. You have to do it in community with each other. So my admonition for everyone this morning is that we need to rely on the resurrected Jesus that is coming again to set the world straight. And we need to live in such a way that proves that we are in that spiritual side of the kingdom, that we are part of his family, which he calls the kingdom of God. That's the lesson for this morning. Next week we'll look at drunkenness and orgies and things like these. I want to get a little bit more into the kingdom next week, because this overlapping idea of circles here, the flesh and the spirit, really relate to what I would call the kingdom. That present evil age that's represented by the flesh, and the age to come that's represented so clearly by the risen Christ, the one who has overcome death. Here, represented by much of the world on this Sunday, of the age to come that he calls us to in chapter 1 of Galatians. That is the realm of the Spirit, because he has left his Spirit for us, to dwell in us, to give us courage. That should give us courage. That's the lesson for this morning. See you all next week. If you have any questions, please email them to sitkachurch@gmail.com. Thanks, everyone.